At 9:17 on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched in the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. The concrete around him was cracked and blackened, the sandbags rotting from weeks of rain. Through the glass of a rifle scope that his fellow officers had laughed at for 6 straight weeks, George studied a banyan tree 240 yards away. He did not move. He did not blink. He waited. John George was 27 years old, an Illinois state rifle champion, the youngest man to ever win the title. And at this point in the war, he had 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. In the last 72 hours, those snipers had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. Not in firefights, not in charges. Men were shot while filling canteens, while walking trails they had already cleared, while standing next to officers who never heard the shot that killed them. The jungle gave no warning. The bullets came from above. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. Other platoon leaders called it his mail-order sweetheart. When George unpacked the Winchester Model 70 at Camp Forest in Tennessee, fitted with a Lyman Alaskan scope and a Griffin and Howe mount, the armorer had laughed and asked whether it was meant for deer season or Europe. George answered without emotion. It was for the Japanese. The unit shipped out before the rifle arrived. George crossed the Pacific, watching other men clean and reclean their issued M1 Garands, while his own weapon sat in a warehouse in Illinois. He filed paperwork. He waited. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant finally handed him a wooden crate stamped fragile. Inside was the rifle George had paid for with 2 years of National Guard wages. The Winchester weighed 9 pounds. The scope added another 12 ounces. The Garand, issued to every other man in the battalion, weighed 9.5 pounds and carried 8 rounds with no magnification. George's rifle was bolt action. 5 rounds. Slower. Older. Civilian. Captain Morris ordered him to leave it in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had taken Henderson Field and held it, but they had failed to clear Mount Austin and the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River. Mount Austin rose 1,514 feet. The Japanese called it the Gifu. 500 defenders. 47 bunkers. The battalion attacked on December 17th and fought for 16 days. 34 men killed. 279 wounded. When the western slope finally fell on January 2nd, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. Point Cruz was different. No bunkers, no fixed lines. Just jungle and massive trees where Japanese soldiers had retreated and disappeared. Some of them were snipers, armed with scoped Arisaka rifles. They knew the terrain. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. On January 20th, 2 men from L Company died on patrol. On January 21st, 3 more were killed. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot. He wanted to know if George's civilian rifle could actually do what George claimed it could. George listed his credentials. Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards in 1939. 23 years old. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards with the Lyman Alaskan. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. That night, George stripped the rifle completely. It had been packed in cosmoline for the ocean crossing. He cleaned it again anyway, checked the mounts, adjusted the scope, loaded 5 rounds of .30-06 ammunition he had carried from Tennessee, the same cartridge the Garand fired. At dawn, on January 22nd, George moved into position alone. George reached the bunker before sunrise. It had been captured 3 days earlier, blasted open by grenades and artillery, then abandoned. From its broken firing slit, the ground dropped away into coconut groves stretching west of Point Cruz. Intelligence said the Japanese snipers favored the largest trees in that area, banyan trees. Some rose more than 90 feet, their trunks thick enough to hide a man completely. A sniper could climb before dawn, settle into the branches, and remain there all day without being seen. George brought no spotter, no radio, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled into the bunker, rested the Winchester against a sandbag, and began to watch. The Lyman Alaskan scope offered only 2.5 power magnification. It was not designed for combat, but it was enough. Enough to catch what the naked eye missed. Enough to turn shadows into shapes. The jungle was never silent. Birds called. Insects buzzed. Somewhere far off, artillery thundered. George filtered it all out. He searched for movement, not sound. He glassed the banyan tree slowly, left to right, top to bottom. At exactly 9:17, a branch shifted. There was no wind. George stopped scanning and watched. The branch moved again, just slightly. 87 feet up, near a fork where 3 limbs met. Then the outline appeared. Dark clothing. A man pressed flat against the wood, facing east, watching the supply trail George's battalion had been using. George adjusted his scope 2 clicks to the right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger broke like glass. He had tuned it himself at Camp Perry before the war. 32 ounces of pressure. No creep. No slack. He squeezed. The rifle recoiled into his shoulder. The crack echoed through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked backward, lost his grip, and fell. His body tore through branches and hit the ground near the base of the banyan tree with a sound George felt more than heard. George worked the bolt. The spent cartridge flew free. He chambered another round and kept his scope on the tree. Nothing moved. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, shooter and spotter. If the man he had just killed was the shooter, the spotter was close, in the same tree or one nearby. George began scanning again, slowly, methodically. The low magnification forced patience. Each tree could hide more than one man. Shadows merged into shapes. Shapes dissolved into leaves. At 9:43, he saw movement again. A different tree, 60 yards north. Lower this time, maybe 50 feet up. A man climbing down fast, retreating. He had heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George led the movement and fired. The second sniper fell backward off the trunk. His rifle clattered through the branches as his body followed. 2 shots. 2 kills. George reloaded from a stripper clip. His hands were steady, his breathing slow. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets could shoot back. At 11:21, a bullet slammed into the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. Dirt sprayed into his face. He rolled left and pressed himself flat against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, a different direction than the first 2. George waited 3 minutes before moving. He eased back to the firing slit and glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have relocated after firing. That was basic doctrine. Shoot and move. But the jungle limited options. At 11:38, George found him. 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet up. The sniper had moved to a different branch, but stayed in the same tree. A mistake. George centered the crosshairs and fired. The 3rd sniper fell without a sound. By noon, 5 Japanese snipers were dead. Word spread through the battalion. Men who had mocked George's rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused. Spectators attracted attention. Attention drew fire. After the 5th kill, the jungle went still. The Japanese adapted. No more movement. No flashes. No shifting branches. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice. He ordered George back into position at dawn. January 23rd began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and reduced visibility to less than 100 yards. George returned to the bunker before dawn and waited. Rain masked movement. It also masked sound. Snipers could climb during storms without being detected. George knew that. So did the Japanese. The rain eased at 8:15. By 8:45, visibility returned enough to work. At 9:12, George spotted the first sniper of the day. The Japanese soldier had climbed during the storm. Smart. He had chosen a tree nearly 290 yards out, farther than any shot from the previous day. Smarter still. They were learning George's limits. George adjusted for distance and wind. The Winchester cracked. The sniper fell. The sixth kill triggered something George hadn't expected. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began landing around the bunker. They had triangulated his position using muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds fell 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. George didn't wait for the third. He grabbed his rifle and ran north along the tree line, diving into a shell crater just as the next salvo struck. The bunker he had occupied seconds earlier vanished in fire and debris. George relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north. It offered cover and a clear view of the groves. He settled in and resumed watching. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them. Now they were hunting him back. This was no longer target shooting. It was a duel. At 14:23, George killed his seventh sniper. At 15:41, he killed his eighth. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up. Good concealment, but the height betrayed him when the sun angle shifted, turning the sniper into a silhouette against the sky. At 1700, Captain Morris sent a runner to pull George out. He had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired. 8 hits. 4 misses. Morris ordered George back at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the math. 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were dead. 3 remained. Those 3 would be the best. The ones who survived by not making mistakes. And now they knew exactly who George was and what rifle he carried. George loaded 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 o'clock, he gave up and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. The rain started again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough to delay operations. George used the time to move to a new position. Not the bunker. Not the fallen tree. Somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He chose a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south of his previous hide. The Marines had used it as a machine gun nest weeks earlier. It offered solid cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. At 7:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. George began glassing. At 8:17, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was in a palm tree 190 yards out. Low, only 40 feet up. Unusual. Most snipers climbed high for visibility. This one had chosen concealment instead. The palm fronds formed a natural hide invisible from ground level. But George wasn't on the ground. From his elevated position on the rocks, he could see down into the fronds. The dark shape of shoulders. The curve of a helmet. George began to squeeze the trigger, then stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too clean. Too obvious. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He had killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make simple mistakes. Unless it was bait. George lowered the rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the palm sniper was a decoy, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for muzzle flash. George checked every tree within 300 yards. Slowly. Methodically. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree, 80 yards northwest of the palm. 91 feet up. Perfect concealment. Branches and vines masked the sniper from three sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's old position at the fallen tree. The sniper was waiting for George to reappear there or to shoot the bait. George had two problems. If he fired at the real sniper, the sound would expose his position, and the man would relocate before George could cycle the bolt. If he did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't where he expected and start searching. George decided to use the bait. He aimed at the palm tree and fired. The decoy sniper fell. George immediately swung the rifle toward the banyan. The real sniper reacted to the shot. He turned toward the sound. That movement was enough. George fired before the man could settle. The sniper fell. 2 shots. 2 kills. But George's position was blown. He grabbed his rifle and ran east along the rock line, dropping into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. 6 seconds later, Japanese machine gun fire shredded the rocks he had just left. George waited, counted to 60, then relocated again. This time to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. He settled in with water up to his chest, rested the Winchester on the rim, and resumed watching. 10 confirmed kills. 1 sniper left. By the morning of January 24th, the jungle around Point Cruz no longer felt chaotic or random. The first days of killing had burned away confusion. 10 Japanese snipers were already dead, and that fact alone changed everything. The men who remained were not careless, not desperate, not reckless. They were the survivors, the ones who had watched their comrades fall and learned from it. George understood that instinctively as he lay half submerged in a shell crater, partially filled with rainwater, the Winchester Model 70 resting across the muddy rim. The water was cold, stagnant, and foul-smelling. It soaked his uniform, crept into his boots, numbed his legs. George ignored all of it. Discomfort no longer mattered. Movement mattered. Patience mattered. The 11th sniper had not revealed himself. George scanned the trees again, knowing even as he did it that the effort might be wasted. The Lyman Alaskan scope brought the jungle closer, but did not grant certainty. Banyan branches overlapped in dense layers. Vines twisted across trunks. Shadows merged into shapes that dissolved when stared at too long. Every dark line could be bark or cloth. Every horizontal break could be a branch or a rifle barrel. George forced himself not to fixate. Fixation led to mistakes. At 9:47, something changed. It was not a movement in the canopy. It was lower, near the edge of his peripheral vision. 60 yards south. Slow. Intentional. Wrong. George did not turn his head. He shifted his attention with his eyes alone, careful not to disturb the water around him. The movement was real. Subtle enough that an untrained observer would have missed it entirely. The sniper was not in a tree. He was on the ground. The Japanese soldier crawled through the undergrowth, using the jungle floor itself as concealment. Ferns, vines, fallen branches, shallow folds in the mud. He moved inches at a time, then froze, letting the environment settle around him. This was not fear-driven movement. It was disciplined, deliberate, professional. George immediately understood the implication. The final sniper was not reacting to George's presence. He was reconstructing George's actions from earlier engagements. He was hunting. George remained motionless. At 9:52, the sniper stopped roughly 40 yards from the rock formation George had used earlier that morning. The Japanese soldier studied the rocks carefully, scanning for the smallest sign of life. George recognized the behavior. This was not guesswork. This was analysis. The sniper was testing assumptions, not acting on impulse. At 9:58, the sniper crawled forward again. 35 yards, 30, 25. He approached from the south, along the same route George had taken when evacuating the rocks under machine gun fire. He had observed that engagement. He had learned from it. George felt a flicker of respect he immediately suppressed. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks and climbed into the old Marine machine gun nest. He positioned himself carefully, facing east, rifle trained on the drainage ditch where George should have relocated if he had followed standard doctrine. The sniper was now less than 40 yards from George's actual position. George had a perfect shot. Center mass. No wind. No movement. An easy kill, even without magnification. George did not fire. The position was wrong. No sniper with this level of patience would remain exposed in a machine gun nest without immediate cover, concealment, or a withdrawal route. The rocks offered none of those. George recognized the tactic instantly. Bait. George forced himself to widen his awareness instead of narrowing it. At 10:06, he found the second man. 70 yards northwest of the rocks, partially concealed behind a fallen tree trunk, another Japanese soldier lay completely still. He had not crawled. He had not shifted. His rifle was already aimed toward the drainage ditch. He was watching where George was supposed to be. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support, or perhaps these were the final 2 working as a pair. Either way, the situation was lethal. If George fired at either man, the other would have time to identify his position and return fire before he could cycle the bolt. The Winchester's precision came at a cost. Time. George needed both men to move. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself deeper into the water until only his eyes and the crown of his head remained above the surface. He angled the rifle upward to keep water out of the barrel. Mud pressed against his chest and ribs. His breathing slowed until each inhale barely disturbed the surface. He waited. At 10:13, the sniper in the rock stood up. He had watched the drainage ditch for 10 minutes without seeing movement. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner. Both men began moving east in parallel, maintaining distance, executing a deliberate sweep pattern. They passed George's crater. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water slowly, silently. Water streamed from his sleeves and dripped from the rifle barrel. He aimed at the nearer soldier, now 42 yards away, and fired. The man collapsed instantly. George worked the bolt and swung the rifle toward the second soldier, firing before the man could fully turn. Both fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. Then George heard voices. Japanese voices. Multiple men. Infantry, not snipers. They were moving toward the bodies. George dropped back into the crater and submerged again, holding the rifle vertical. The water was cold and filthy. He ignored it. The voices stopped near the first body. He heard equipment shifting, boots in mud, urgent conversation. Then the voices moved again, closer. They had found his tracks. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the rim of the crater and looked down. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George cycled the bolt underwater, rose, and fired twice more as 2 additional soldiers rushed the crater. Both dropped. 3 rounds left. Shouting erupted. More men were coming. George rolled out the opposite side of the crater and ran. Bullets snapped through branches and dirt around him. He dropped behind a fallen tree as 2 soldiers advanced toward the crater. George fired once. 1 fell. 2 rounds left. He heard voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking. 1 group from the south, another from the east. George understood the reality immediately. He could not win a firefight with a bolt-action rifle against multiple infantrymen. He broke contact. George ran north through vines and mud for over a minute before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. He pressed himself against the wall and listened. The voices faded. The Japanese regrouped around their dead instead of pursuing. At 11:13, George reached American lines. Behind him, the jungle finally went quiet. The Point Cruz groves were quiet. George returned to his tent and stripped the Winchester down to bare metal. Mud clogged the action. Water filled the barrel. He cleaned every component by lantern light, running patch after patch through the bore until they came out clean. He reassembled the rifle, checked the scope mounts, adjusted eye relief, and loaded 5 fresh rounds. At 1400 hours, A runner arrived from battalion headquarters. The commander wanted to see him. George walked over expecting reprimand. Unauthorized solo operations. Excessive risk. Instead, he found Captain Morris with two senior officers. One was Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry did not waste time. He asked a single question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George answered honestly. He said he could try, but it would require time, rifles with optics, and men who already knew how to shoot. Ferry told him the division had 14 Springfield rifles with inertial scopes left behind by the Marines and 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted a sniper section. George agreed, with one condition. He kept his Winchester. Ferry approved it. Training began on January 27th. 40 men assembled at a makeshift range east of Henderson Field. On paper, they were experts. In reality, none had hunted men from concealment. George started with fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, reading wind in jungle conditions where flags did not exist and vegetation lied. The Springfield rifles were heavy, stable, but exhausting to hold. George taught them to use terrain: rocks, logs, sandbags, anything that turned the jungle into a firing platform. For 3 days, they shot. Stationary targets, moving targets, targets partially hidden by leaves and vines. By January 30th, 32 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George paired them into 16 two-man teams: shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. He watched for movement and provided security. After each engagement, roles could switch. No single point of failure. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field west of the Matanikau River. Intelligence said Japanese stragglers were still operating there. Infantry, not snipers. The teams moved into position before dawn. George paired with Corporal Hayes. They covered a supply trail the Japanese had been using. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier stepped onto the trail. Hayes confirmed. George fired. The man dropped. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more targets. 7 shots, 6 kills. 1 miss due to wind. The other teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day. 0 American casualties. The sniper section continued operations through early February. By February 9th, they had 74 confirmed kills. Only bodies observed were counted. No estimates. The Japanese evacuation accelerated. Destroyers arrived at night to pull troops from Cape Esperance. Rear guards fought delaying actions. George's section was tasked with eliminating covering forces. On February 7th, near the Tanamboga River, a Japanese rifleman hit George in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around. Hayes dragged him to cover. The bullet passed through muscle without striking bone. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. He spent 2 weeks recovering while the Japanese completed their withdrawal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. Guadalcanal was over. George's section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills. 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. While George recovered, orders arrived from Pacific Command. Experienced jungle officers were needed for a new mission. Classified: Burma. George volunteered. By March, George was aboard a transport ship heading west. His Winchester was sealed in a waterproof case. The Lyman Alaskan was wrapped in oilcloth. He did not know the details, only that it involved long-range patrols behind Japanese lines. In April, he arrived in India and joined a new unit. Officially, the 5,307th Composite Unit. Unofficially, Merrill's Marauders. Training began immediately. Jungle survival, long-range penetration, operations without supply lines. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion as a rifle platoon leader. There was no sniper designation in the Army's tables. but his reputation had followed him. The terrain was worse than Guadalcanal. Steeper, wetter, thicker. George modified his rifle. He replaced the Lyman Alaskan with a lighter Weaver 330. Same magnification, less weight. He swapped the stock to reduce ounces. Every ounce mattered. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their mission was to take the Myitkyina airfield. 4,000 Japanese defenders. No roads, mountains, jungle. Everything carried on their backs. The march lasted months. Men collapsed. Malaria spread. Mules died. By May, the unit had covered over 700 miles. George fired his Winchester 3 times during the campaign. 3 shots, 3 kills, each followed by immediate movement. 1 shot announced his position. A second invited death. On May 17th, the Marauders took Myitkyina. The unit was spent. Disease had taken more men than combat. George survived. His rifle survived. But the war had changed. Close-range ambushes replaced long shots. Semi-automatic rifles ruled. By June, George was evacuated. The unit was disbanded. He returned to the United States in July 1944. Promoted. Assigned to Fort Benning. He trained officers. Jungle movement. Marksmanship. Independent operations. He never fired the Winchester in combat again. George left the Army in 1947. Lieutenant Colonel. 2 Bronze Stars. Purple Heart. Combat Infantry Badge. He went to Princeton. Then Oxford. Then Africa. Later Washington. He never spoke publicly about Point Cruz. He wrote it down once. The manuscript became a book. Shots fired in anger. Technical. Precise. Still read. John George died in 2009. His Winchester Model 70 rests in a museum. It looks like any other hunting rifle. It is not. It is the rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days, when a battalion could not do it in 2 weeks. After Burma, George understood something few officers admitted out loud. Guadalcanal had been a perfect storm. Terrain, distance, time, and an enemy that relied on concealment over maneuver. In that narrow window, an individual rifleman with exceptional skill could dominate space far beyond his numbers. Burma proved the opposite. Dense jungle collapsed distance. Engagements happened at 30 yards, sometimes less. Fire superiority mattered more than precision. The Winchester Model 70, flawless on Point Cruz, was rarely needed. Not because it failed, but because the war had shifted. George was reassigned stateside in mid-1944. At Fort Benning, he trained infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He did not teach heroics. He taught fundamentals. How to move without being seen. How to read terrain. How to decide when not to shoot. He rarely mentioned Guadalcanal. When asked, he minimized it. Said he had been lucky. Said the Japanese had made mistakes. Said the rifle helped. The Winchester stayed with him. It had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee, across the Pacific to Guadalcanal, then to India, into Burma, and back again. It sat in a footlocker, occasionally cleaned, rarely fired. The Army was changing. Standardization, mass production, semi-automatic rifles, identical equipment, identical training. Individual craftsmanship mattered less than logistics. George understood why. He did not argue against it, but he knew something had been lost. He left the Army in January 1947. Lieutenant Colonel. 2 Bronze Stars. 1 Purple Heart. Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to civilian life quietly. Princeton, Oxford, Africa, Washington. Policy work. Lectures. Committees. Few people knew what he had done on Guadalcanal. Fewer still knew about the Point Cruz groves. In 1947, George began writing. Not memoir. Documentation. He wrote about rifles, ammunition, ballistics, jungle behavior, Japanese tactics. He wrote without drama, without embellishment. 6 months of work produced more than 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association convinced him to publish. The book was titled Shots Fired in Anger. It never became popular literature. It became something else. A reference. A manual. a quiet classic. Decades passed. Wars came and went. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf. Sniping became formalized. Dedicated schools, purpose-built rifles, optics designed for combat. Everything George had improvised became doctrine. The lessons of Guadalcanal were relearned by new generations who never heard his name. John George died on January 3, 2009, 90 years old. His Winchester Model 70 was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Virginia. It sits behind glass, wood stock, blued steel, civilian scope. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks ordinary. It is not. It is the rifle that proved that training could outweigh doctrine, that patience could defeat numbers, that a single man, properly prepared, could change the outcome of a fight. 11 snipers in 4 days. 14 American lives saved. A battalion freed to move. If you're watching this, you're not just hearing a story, you're keeping it alive. These men don't need monuments. They need memory. Hit like if this mattered. Subscribe if you want more stories pulled from the margins of history. Drop a comment and say where you're watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served. This channel exists for one reason, so stories like John George's don't disappear into silence.